They laughed when Ada Mercer left Ruth Mercer a burned-out smokehouse on Flint Knoll. By the end of that winter, 19 freezing people would crawl into that blackened ruin, and thank God the old woman had trusted the only person in the family nobody bothered to see. If you love stories of frontier grit and quiet intelligence, subscribe to Winter Whispers, and tell us where you're watching from in the comments. November of 1891 had already gone mean in Crow's Crossing, Montana, when Ada Mercer finally lost the coughing sickness that had been carving the strength out of her since spring. She died on the 9th day of the month in the narrow cabin where she had lived alone for 29 years, and the family came up the hill not to mourn her, but to measure what she had left behind. Everybody in Crow's Crossing believed Ada Mercer had hidden money. She sold herbs, wool, smoked meat, and rabbit pelts for years, never wasted a cent, and trusted no bank farther than she could walk to before dark. The question was not whether Ada had saved something, the question was who she had decided to favor. Ruth Mercer already knew the answer would not be her. She was 24, rented a back room over the livery for $1.50 a week, and earned 10 cents an hour stitching torn seams at Calder's Mercantile. She owned 2 dresses, 1 pair of half-patched winter boots, and a reputation for being useful without ever being important. In families like the Mercers, those were not the same thing. Her Uncle Bram, who ran the broad hay meadows along Miller Creek, would take the cabin and whatever cash remained in it. Her cousin Hal would take the south pasture Ada had bought cheap after a grass fire 15 years earlier. Ruth's father Jonah, a decent man with a weak spine where Bram was concerned, would be handed whatever looked too small to fight over. Ruth herself, who had walked up that hill every other Sunday for 6 years carrying broth, thread, lamp oil, and company, would receive nothing at all. The loud were rewarded, the useful were thanked, if anyone remembered. Reverend Pike unfolded the papers and began to read. The cabin and its contents went to Bram, along with $320 in folded notes discovered inside a flour tin beneath Ada's bed. Hal received the south pasture and the legal claim to its spring. Jonah received $90, an iron brace of hand tools, and Ada's old shaving mirror that had belonged to his father. 2 cousins in Helena received small sums by post. Then Reverend Pike paused. He adjusted his spectacles, looked again at the final page, and read the last clause with visible care.
To my niece Ruth Mercer, the only member of this family who ever climbed the hill empty-handed of greed, I leave the smokehouse ruin on Flint Knoll, together with the half-acre enclosed around it, and all rights, fixtures, improvements, and appurtenances attached thereto. The room held still for one breath. Then Bram Mercer laughed so hard he slapped the arm of his chair. Hal bent forward with his face in his palm. Bram's wife Cora did not laugh loudly, which somehow made it worse. She gave Ruth the small, thin smile people reserve for the unlucky when they believe misfortune has finally made itself ridiculous. The smokehouse on Flint Knoll had burned in a lightning strike 4 summers earlier. Afterward, it was just a gutted shell of fire brick, caved rafters, warped iron hoops, and soot-black stone too far uphill and too battered to salvage cleanly. There was no market for it, and hardly even kindling worth the hauling. Bram wiped tears of laughter from his cheeks. She left the girl a chimney with no house. A pretty inheritance, Hal said. Mind the ashes don't blow away before she can move in. Ruth felt every eye in the room slide toward her, waiting to see whether she would flush or weep or ask someone to explain the joke more gently. She did none of those things. She rose, crossed to Reverend Pike, accepted the folded deed, thanked him in a steady voice, tucked the paper into her coat, and walked out into the hard evening air while Bram's laughter was still bumping against the walls behind her. Ruth climbed the stairs to her rented room, lit the lamp, unfolded the deed, and read the line that mattered 3 times. All rights, fixtures, improvements, and appurtenances attached thereto. Improvements. That word sat on the page like a stone in her hand. No one in Crow's Crossing would have used it for a burned-out smokehouse. Ada Mercer, however, had never used words carelessly. She had been hard, suspicious, private, and stubborn as a gatepost in drought, but never foolish. If she had called that ruin an improvement, then something about Flint Knoll had not burned with the rafters. 3 days later, before dawn had fully broken, Ruth borrowed a mule and a low dray from Eli Navarro, the stableman whose wife she had once helped through a fever. She loaded a pry bar, a shovel, 2 water jugs, a coil of rope, and a cold wedge of cornbread wrapped in cloth. Eli watched her tie the last knot and asked, "Where are you hauling to in this wind?" "Flint Knoll." He glanced up toward the ridge. Ada used to spend whole afternoons there after the smokehouse burned. Just sat on a stump and stared at the ruin. Folks thought grief had made her strange. Maybe it made her patient, Ruth said. Flint Knoll rose west of town in a long shoulder of yellow grass and broken limestone. The climb to the ruin was steeper than it looked from below. The mule could only take the dray halfway. After that, Ruth carried the tools by hand and returned for the rest. By the time she reached the top, the wind had already found her coat seams and needled cold through to the skin. The front wall had slumped inward. 2 charred rafters leaned against the broken opening like black ribs. Firebrick lay scattered in red heaps around a square footprint maybe 14 feet across. The iron bar that had once held meat hooks hung twisted into a shape like a question mark. Grass had grown through the ash. One corner was buried in windblown grit. The whole thing looked tired, dead, and offensively useless. Ruth stood there a long minute with the deed folded in her pocket and a dull little shame pressing between her ribs. Then she remembered Ada's wording, set down the pry bar, and began to work. She started from the outside, sorting the wreckage instead of flinging it. Bricks on one side, charred timber on another. Bent iron in a third pile. She scraped ash from the surviving floor, peeled back drifted grit, blistered her palms, and by midday had exposed most of the footprint without finding anything except old fire scars and compacted dirt. Maybe Bram had been right. Maybe Ada's final joke had simply been crueler than Ruth wanted to believe. She nearly stood to leave. Nearly. Instead, she walked back to the ruin and crouched beside the north wall where the bricks had collapsed in a tighter pattern than the rest. Not burned out, she realized. Arranged. Beneath a spill of soot-black debris sat 3 courses of red brick laid too neatly to be accident. Ada had stacked them after the fire. Ruth cleared them one by one. Below them she found an iron ring set flush into a square plate the color of dried blood. Her pulse kicked hard. She hooked the pry bar through the ring and pulled. At first, nothing moved. Then the square plate gave with a groan deep enough to feel in the soles of her boots, and a trap door lifted from the brickwork on hidden hinges. A breath of warm air rose against her face. Not hot, not steam, just steady warmth carrying wet stone, mineral water, and old smoke. Ruth knelt at the opening and stared into darkness. Brick steps descended under the ruin in a tight turn. The passage was narrow, whitewashed once and later darkened by age. A lantern niche had been cut into the wall at shoulder height. Someone had used this entrance many times, and expected to use it again. Ruth went back to the dray for the lamp she had brought, lit it with shaking hands, and climbed down. The stair turned once, then opened into a room that forced all the air from her lungs. It was not a cellar in the ordinary sense. It was a vault, 20 feet long, maybe 15 wide, with an arched ceiling of fitted limestone and brick laid so carefully the joints looked almost poured. Flagstone, dry underfoot except along the far side, where a narrow runnel carried a ribbon of clear water beneath an iron grate and into the wall. 2 vent shafts climbed upward from opposite corners. The air inside, held at a clean, impossible 52 degrees, as if winter had been stopped at the door and told it had no jurisdiction there. Ruth raised the lamp higher. Shelves lined the walls from knee height, nearly to the ceiling, and every shelf was full. Crocks of beans sealed in wax, jars of pears and cherries, smoked trout packed in rendered fat, salted venison, onion ropes, turnips in sand, flour tins, soap bars, wrapped bundles of dried yarrow, willow bark, mullein, and wintergreen. A water barrel twice the size of the one in Ruth's boarding room. 3 oil lamps. 2 sacks of coal. Kindling stacked in a rack. A narrow iron cot with wool blankets folded so squarely they might have been laid there that morning. A carpenter's chest. A small cast iron stove bolted to a slate pad, with its pipe already fixed into the flue channel above. Against the back wall stood a work table with a ledger, a sewing basket, and a leather-bound journal. Ada had not hidden supplies. She had built a winter hold. Ruth set the lamp down and opened the journal. The first entry was dated May 3, 1873. Started cutting the chamber wider today. Limestone is friendlier than pride. It splits if you strike where the truth already runs. Ruth turned pages with both hands. June, 1874. Spring under the wall runs warm enough. Good. We'll line the west side next. February, 1882. A room above ground can be taken. A room below ground must first be imagined. September, 1891. Shelves complete for the season. 287 stores counted. Ruth will know what to do. For years, she had thought Ada merely private. Now she understood the scale of that privacy. The old woman had spent nearly 2 decades building a refuge under a ruin everyone dismissed, carrying brick, pipe, jars, coal, and seed up a hill 1 load at a time, while the town mistook endurance for eccentricity. And she had done it for Ruth. When she climbed back to the surface, the daylight looked thinner than before. The burned bricks around the opening no longer seemed pathetic. They were a mask, a lie placed over the truth by the smartest person in the family. Ruth closed the trapdoor, reset the brick courses exactly as she had found them, scattered ash over the seams, and stood in the cutting wind with a new understanding settling into place. She would tell no one. For the next 7 weeks, she worked 2 lives. By day, she mended shirts and answered politely when people asked whether she had moved into her grand new estate on Flint Knoll. Bram stopped her once outside the mercantile and said, with fake generosity, "If that ruin's burdening you, girl, I'll take it off your hands for $5. Ruth smiled. No need.
Keep what was given me. The look in his eyes after that was brief but instructive. Annoyance, suspicion, then the confidence of a man who assumes time will do his stealing for him. By evening, Ruth climbed the hill. She carried blankets, her Bible, her mother's china mug, a skillet, needles, thread, flour, coffee, rendered tallow, and a small framed tintype of herself at age 9, standing rigid before grief had bent him. She brought a crate of apples, bought cheap because they were bruised. She traded mended clothes to the blacksmith's widow for split wood. She patched a crack near the vent shaft with lime and clay. She learned the exact sound the spring made under the grate at night, and how the stove drew best when the lower vent was opened a finger's width. One evening she found a blue-ticked hound shivering under the steps behind Calder's store, ribs visible through its hide, one ear torn half through by something meaner and stronger. She whistled once. The dog followed her out of town and up Flint Knoll without argument, as though it had been waiting for instructions all along. She named him Cinder. By Christmas, the vault under the smokehouse was more habitable than any place Ruth had lived in her life. The warm spring beneath the floor kept the stone from turning bitter. The little stove lifted the room into the 60s with half the fuel a surface cabin would have needed, and above all, the place could not be seen. Ruth reinforced the trap door from below with a crossbar of seasoned oak. On the surface, she rebuilt the ruin's disguise even better than Ada had left it. She scattered more broken brick, wedged a charred rafter at the old angle, let tumbleweed catch in the same corner. From 10 feet away, it looked abandoned. From 3 feet away, it looked dangerous to step on. That was better. January came with a string of hard mornings that froze wash water in the bucket before dawn. Teamsters slapped their mules bloody to keep them moving. Window panes flowered over white from the inside. More than once, Ruth passed the church and saw smoke leaking from every crack because people had begun gathering there after dark to stretch their firewood by sharing walls. Even Jonah never asked where she was sleeping. That omission cut deeper than Bram's laughter. Under Flint Knoll, that neglect became armor. Men who would have claimed the vault on principle never thought to look for advantage in the hands of a seamstress. Bram stacked feed badly and trusted the size of his barn to compensate for carelessness. Hal bragged that weather was only weather. In the second week of February, the sky over Crow's Crossing took on a color Ruth did not trust. It was not the pale clean gray of ordinary snow. It was a low iron lid stretching from horizon to horizon, with a green cast near sunset and a wind that kept changing its mind. The old trappers at Calder's Stove muttered about a northern break.
Eli Navarro moved the livery horses into the lee side without being told. Ravens flew east, and kept flying. On the 14th of February, just after noon, the storm arrived. It hit in layers. First came the wind, hard enough to bend the grass flat, and drive loose grit against windows like thrown shot. Then the temperature dropped so fast people in town talked about hearing boards crack as the cold took them. Snow followed in a slant so dense it erased the next building over. By dusk, fences had vanished. By midnight, drifts had reached porch roofs on the west side of the street. The wind screamed over Flint Knoll, with a sound like a train passing inches above the earth. Ruth was below ground, with cinder pressed against her boots, when the first true violence of the storm struck. The trapdoor thudded in its frame, fine dust sifted from the stair seam, and the stovepipe began to sing in a thin metallic note. Ruth banked the fire, checked the vent, and let the mountain above her take the full force of the blizzard. It lasted 30 hours. Below, it remained 58 degrees without strain. Soup simmered. Water did not freeze. The shelves stayed full. Ruth thought of Crow's Crossing then, and no pleasure touched the thought, only knowledge. On the second night, something new entered the storm. Knocking. Not the loose batter of wind-thrown debris. Knuckles. Desperate. Repeated. Ruth stood at once. Cinder was already growling toward the stairs. She took the lamp in one hand and the hatchet from the woodpile in the other, and climbed until her voice could reach the hatch. "Who is it?" At first, the storm answered for them. Then a man's voice came through the boards, ragged and nearly gone. "Ruth. Ruth. Open if you're there. For God's sake." Jonah. Her father's voice. Behind it, she heard a child crying, and someone coughing the way people do, when cold has settled too deep in the lungs. Ruth lifted the bar. The hatch fought her because snow had packed against it. She shoved harder. It opened a hand's width, then wider, and the storm punched down the stair in a white roar. Jonah Mercer stumbled first into the opening, beard crusted solid with ice, eyebrows white, one glove missing. Behind him came Bram, carrying a girl under one arm and dragging a boy by the wrist. Cora's face was so cold it had gone gray. Hal stumbled with blood on his cheek where the wind had skinned him. Behind them, shapes kept emerging from the snow. Eli Navarro with his wife, Reverend Pike, the hotel cook, 2 logging hands from the North Camp, Mrs. Calder, 3 children wrapped in horse blankets, and a widow Ruth knew only as Mrs. Beale clutching a baby inside her coat. 19 souls in all, counting Ruth. Ruth stepped back and let them come down. They filled the vault wall to wall. Steam rose from wet coats. One of the logging hands could barely stand. Cora's fingers were waxen at the tips. The baby under Mrs. made no sound at all, which frightened Ruth more than crying would have. Boots off if they're wet through, Ruth said. Blankets here. Children by the stove. Reverend, take that bench. Eli, help me with the kettle. Jonah, close the hatch and drop the bar. People obeyed. Ruth fed them in waves. Bean stew first, then slices of smoked meat, then hot water with molasses for the children, because sugar hits faster than pride. She set Cora's hands in a basin of warm water and made her hold them there despite the pain. She cut the logging man's boot away from one foot and found 2 toes already gone white and hard. She rubbed life back where she could, and did not pretend to the rest. She piled blankets on the bench and put the baby against the stove side of Mrs. Beale's chest, until a thin, angry wail finally broke from under the shawl, and every adult in the room looked toward that sound like worshippers hearing a bell. Bram Mercer sat against the limestone wall and stared at the shelves, the stove, the runnel of warm water under the grate, the ceiling his aunt had built under a ruin he had laughed at with his whole open mouth. 6 hours passed before he found anything to say. When he did, his voice had gone smaller than Ruth had ever heard it. She made all this, he said. Ruth was wrapping another blanket around the little girl Bram had carried in. The child had stopped shivering and fallen asleep with her face against Ruth's shoulder. She did, Ruth said. Bram looked around the room once more, this time as though measuring not the size of it, but the size of his own failure to imagine it. She expected something like this. No, Ruth said. She expected winter. That's not the same thing. People forget that. They remained under Flint Knoll for 4 days. The storm eased first into blowing snow, then into a killing stillness that held the drifts in place and made the whole world above ground dangerous in a new way. Food thinned, but not alarmingly. The vault held. The warm spring kept moving under the grate. Children slept head to foot in a nest of coats by the stove. Shame changed the room more slowly than temperature did, but Ruth saw it working. Hal could not meet her eyes. Cora thanked her over broth the second morning, and sounded like the words had scraped her on the way out. Reverend Pike stood staring at Ada's journal on the table, and whispered, I buried her without understanding what sort of woman she was. Jonah said little, which was his way when guilt had finally grown too honest to dodge. On the 3rd night, while most of the others slept, he sat beside Ruth, near the dying blue edge of the stove fire, and said, I should have defended you years ago. Ruth looked at the lamp, not at him. Yes, she said. It was the truest answer she had ever given him. By the morning of the 18th, the sky outside had cleared to a bitter blue. Men climbed out first, and hacked a path through drifts cut taller than a horse's back. Sunlight on the snow was so bright it made the eyes water. One roof in town had collapsed entirely. Half the church porch was gone. Bram's big hay barn leaned in on itself with a broken shoulder where the wind had taken it. The North Camp's bunkhouse roof had failed. 2 cattle were found frozen against a drift line, not 50 yards from shelter they had never reached. One by one, the people under Flint Knoll climbed into that white silence and stood blinking in the light. No one laughed. No one called the Smokehouse ruin worthless. They looked at the broken black shell, the drift-packed hill, the town below still half buried in snow. And then at Ruth, and every one of them understood the same humiliating fact. They were alive because Ada Mercer had planned in secret, and because Ruth Mercer had understood enough to keep that plan intact until the day it mattered. Jonah was the last to leave. He paused at the top of the path, with his hat in both hands, and said, Your aunt saw farther than the rest of us. Ruth nodded. Then he added, voice rougher now, so did you. She watched him go. After the others had disappeared down the cut path toward town, Ruth stood alone beside the burned smokehouse, with Cinder at her knee, and the cold sun laying hard light over the drifts. Ruth climbed back below, dropped the hatch, and set the bar in place. The vault was quieter after 19 people than it had ever been before. Blankets lay rumpled. A spoon sat forgotten near the basin. The air held the lingering scent of broth, wet wool, and wood smoke. Cinder circled twice and settled by the stove. Ruth picked up Ada's journal and turned to the final page. She had read the last dated entry before. She had not noticed the smaller line written beneath it, tucked so close to the margin, it seemed almost hidden on purpose. What winter cannot spare, prepared love can. Ruth read it twice. Then she closed the journal, held it against her chest, and sat in the warm stone room while the mountain kept its silence around her. Above, the world was still brutal, still hungry, still capable of forgetting the quiet people who kept it alive. Below, in the chamber Ada had buried under mockery and ash, Ruth finally understood a truth she would carry the rest of her life. The loud may inherit the house, but when the real storm comes, survival belongs to the one who knew where to build. Thank you for watching. If this story stayed with you, share it with someone who believes quiet strength is still strength. And subscribe to Winter Whispers for more stories of resilience, wisdom, and survival.